you need some kind of exclusivity and where that began. So how do you extract a signal, a message, out of this cacophony of electromagnetic energy that surrounds all of us? We're literally bathed in radio waves. Some of them are natural. Most of them are man-made in one form or another. There are a lot of people, and I'm sure that somebody's going to bring this up. Well, can't you, using CDMA or ultra-wideband, can't you really put two people in the same spot at the same time? And the bottom line is, no, you cannot do that. There is no free lunch. All the technologies that we use to access the spectrum, whether they're time division, code division, spatial division, they all carve up the spectrum in such a way that a specific communication has exclusive use of a piece of the spectrum. But there are degrees of exclusivity. There's an extreme example that I'm sure you're all very much aware of. A long time ago, in an overzealous effort to defend the right of the public to watch the 50th rerun of Law and Order, a single broadcast channel was given exclusive use of 6 megahertz of bandwidth. That's what we call it, a television channel, but also of a number of other channels that could have been useful to others, but were prohibited from operating to protect the channels that were allocated. As a result of this overzealousness, a single 6 megahertz channel has regulatory exclusivity over what could be as much as 30 or 40 megahertz. We call these restrictions, by the way, these guard bands. We call them the taboos, and if that brings to mind magic and sorcery, that's not surprising, because there's very little connection with today's technology between the allocation of those guard bands and the need for the guard bands. In fact, television channels with today's technology can not only operate at every 6 megahertz, but finally, after a number of years of effort, we can actually generate 6 television channels providing exactly the same kind of signal in that same 6 megahertz, and do that every 6 megahertz. But meanwhile, those taboos still exist. Most of the users of the spectrum don't have that luxury. My proposal today suggests that if we could suddenly create a huge abundance of radio spectrum, the need for all of these creative proposals, let's change the regulatory process, let's invent new technology, that none of these would be necessary. If there was enough radio spectrum available so that anyone who needed to occupy a portion of the spectrum for a period of time and have exclusive use for that portion of the spectrum, then there would be enough spectrum so that the only regulatory effort we would ever need is just to police people to make sure that they didn't go beyond the bounds of what they actually needed. So I want to repeat that again. What is the dream of somebody who wants to use the radio spectrum effectively? If we could devise a system that allowed us to operate in the spectrum, to use only the amount of bandwidth for only the time that we needed it over just exactly the geography that we wanted, and to do that with the best available transmission technology, if we could do that, we wouldn't need any regulation. Just tell everybody to just use what they need when they need it. The ability of the spectrum to handle traffic would increase by something in excess of 1 million times, and probably a lot more than that than what is available today. I did an analysis that I'd like to share with you. Where I measured what I call the efficiency of wireless spectrum. The technical term it uses bits per hertz per second per square mile, but it's really a much more simple concept than that. I'm suggesting that if we figured out at any point in time, starting with Marconi's stuff, which was in the last decade of the 19th century, but starting from then, if we used all of the useful spectrum and used the best transmission technique that was available, how many conversations could you do in the whole world? And the first point's really easy, because when Marconi did his transatlantic transmission, he used all of the available spectrum. He used what's called the spark gap transmitter. And if anybody else tried to communicate anywhere in the world, they would have interfered with each other. So that gives me a really good point at the beginning. I've mentioned several points on here, but the fact is that we have improved our ability. We can now send out over all the available spectrum, if we use the best techniques, over the whole world, over 1 trillion conversations, 1 trillion times more effective use of the spectrum than Marconi did. What's interesting, there are a number of interesting observations that you can make from this. You notice the dotted line that follows the year 2006, which is where, or 2007, which is where we are today. We know enough that we can conceive of improving the way we use the radio spectrum from today through 50 years from now to have 1 million times more improvement. That's a kind of startling conclusion. There are a couple of other comments that I can make about this curve. First of all, I drew a straight line, but the improvement was not linear. In general, the improvements occurred in step functions, and they occurred for only 2 reasons. One is that people were starved for spectrum, so they used a lot of technology. They were driven to create new technology to use the spectrum better. The second stimulation was the government just go and do it. And the 2 examples of that are land mobile, where, and this is where I started my career some 50 years ago, had a very small segment of the spectrum, very quickly growing, and over a period of 10 or 15 years, they figured out how to start out with 300 kilohertz channels down to 120 kilohertz, 60 kilohertz, 30, 15, kept squeezing the spectrum down to improve their ability to serve a lot of different customers. The best example of the government driving it was cellular telephony, because the spectrum for cellular telephony was allocated based upon the premise that people could do a step function improvement in technology. There's a third observation that is really a lot more significant than bits per second per hertz, and that is that consistent with this improvement in spectral efficiency, the cost of delivering information has gone down comparably. It turns out, and by the way, I did these 2 analyses totally independently, and it turns out that the cost of delivering some fixed message has dropped in half every 2.5 years, every 42 months, also for over a century. And I did put a few more points on this curve, and somebody's going to ask me why the WiMAX curve, which, as you see, is out here at 2010, because WiMAX isn't here yet, and why it has a vertical oval. Anybody want to know that? I'm sure you do. It's because WiMAX is not defined yet. And in fact, if you look at what WiMAX is, this part of WiMAX is WiMAX without what we call smart antennas, and that's the whole purpose of this talk, if you guys didn't get that impression from Tom. And the most effective part of this oval is full use of what we know about smart antennas today. So as a result of this progress, the fact that we have been literally multiplying the available capacity of the spectrum, we really have never used very much of the radio spectrum. And we're not using very much of it today. I knew that would happen. We'll come to the slide that's supposed to be here now later, and you'll remember why it was supposed to be there. The fact is that there is no scarcity of spectrum. There has never been a persistent shortage of spectrum in the past, and there never need be. This issue of spectrum scarcity is really, in my judgment, a myth. Why is it that we don't fill up the radio spectrum? Well, we do a lot of things that kind of waste the radio spectrum, that don't use it. We assigned guard bands, and I gave you the example of TV, that were useful, were necessary at the time the guard bands were assigned, but then as technology advanced, and we have dramatic movements in technology happening continuously, we leave the same guard bands there. We assign spectrum to people that don't use it, or maybe they just use it occasionally. We assign spectrum over broad areas and find out that people only use that spectrum in a very small part of the area. And we assign huge amounts of spectrum to unlicensed services with the mistaken belief that there is, in fact, a free lunch. That spectrum is fungible, that if you make the spectrum unlicensed, that everybody can use it and can gain the same benefits that you can get from licensed spectrum. Despite these practices, despite this misuse of the spectrum, we always seem to find room for new services. We always seem to find a little bit of spectrum to try out a new technology. How many businesses do you know that have started and actually failed? The fact is, very simply, we are creating spectrum faster than we're consuming it. So before I tell you how we're going to do this new spectrum creation, I want to talk for a minute about, since this is a talk about personal communications, do we really need this bandwidth? Why create a lot of new spectrum if, in fact, we're never going to be able to use it? You think about personal communications. For many years, we provided personal communications with radio pagers that just required a few bits per second to operate. We graduated to analog voice, which had a bandwidth of maybe 4 kilobits per second. With cellular, we got to digital voice, which is quite as good as analog voice, but that's up to 10 to 13 kilobits per second. It gives us some other benefit. And yet, when we listen to a CD, we listen to music and talking with 100 kilobit per second, much higher quality. There's a lot of room for improvement in voice quality alone. You may be unaware that the reason that you hear the particular quality that we listen to when we listen to the telephone is that somebody at Bell Laboratories many years ago decided there were only two criteria. One is that you be able to understand the words, and the second is that you be able to recognize the other person's voice. So they made a decision that we really don't need a quality of voice. What we needed were just those two characteristics. I don't think we're satisfied with that anymore. I think there's a lot more room for improvement in voice communications, but now we're starting to talk about delivery of video to people. And for 60 years, we've been watching television with a resolution of just a few 100,000 pixels. Now, after I found out reading one of Tom's papers, it took us some 25 years just to go through the regulatory process. Is that right for TV? And we now can watch HD with about 1.5 million pixels of resolutions. And yet you can go to the store today and buy a camera that's got 10 million pixels of resolution. And if you look inside your eyeball,